Thanks very much. Thank you, Deborah, for the invitation to be here, and to all the organizers and to all of you for being present. I'll just flag at the beginning, while I've thought quite extensively about transitional justice and within that context, memorialization, thinking about AI, partly because of its newness in the context of transitional justice, is newer to me. And so I look forward in the questions to pointing out where I'm wrong, or where I may need to complicate things, or what I might not have been thinking about, either in that space or in the other parts of the talk. So I'm going to first talk about how I approach questions of memorialization, or the context and what I'm thinking about where that question of the topic of memorialization comes up. Talk a little bit about the place of memorialization as one tool among many for dealing with past wrongdoing in the context of transitional justice, and then focus some time on AI-based holograms that are being used in memorials and museums, and talk about why they're being utilized, and then end with 3 worries I have about their utilization. So the Commission of Widespread Atrocities, this is kind of by way of introducing you to transitional justice if you're not familiar with that term or debates already. The Commission of Widespread Atrocities is a prominent feature of contemporary conflicts and patterns of repression. With democratic backsliding, we can anticipate this will continue to get worse. Often, but not always, atrocities can set in motion a race to the moral bottom, where counter-atrocities are committed by groups in conflict or across divides to avenge atrocities against one's own group, which is met with counter-atrocities. In the context of the Balkans in the 90s, a lot of the memory wars, avenging what had happened to the Serbs back in, hundreds of years before that, and is one example of a context where this kind of dynamic cycle played out. And the moral and political necessity of ending atrocities and human rights violations when they're occurring by ending conflict and repression generates what's been known as the peace versus justice dilemma that transitional justice scholarship thinks about and tries to navigate. So what that dilemma is basically framed: a necessary condition for ending atrocities is that perpetrators stop doing them and committing them. And pursuing accountability for perpetrators of atrocities can make that possibility that they'll stop committing them less likely. So if you're in armed conflict and you think that you're going to end up at the ICC, less reason to stop fighting, but rather reason to continue on fighting more. And yet at the same time, no accountability is not morally tenable. That if any wrongdoing merits accountability, then especially egregious wrongdoing that in many cases involves the commission of international crimes and violations of international law, require accountability. And so then societies have faced the question, so then what do you do? And the answers that have been offered in societies across the globe have varied in how this dilemma is navigated. And within each of the societies in which one of these answers is pursued, there is, of course, rigorous debate and disagreement about the defensibility of the choice that's been made. So one kind of response is to sacrifice justice. You saw throughout South America, for example, as a way of ending military juntas and transitioning to democracy, the granting of blanket amnesty, right? As a way of ending disappearing and other patterns of rights violations and achieving some measure of peace and democracy. Another response is no justice, no peace. And so you dissolve the dilemma by pursuing accountability. So you can think of the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II, where there wasn't a negotiated peace, as is the case in many contexts, but a unilateral victor imposing peace, and then having the context for the pursuit of trials in Nuremberg and the model that set up. Different kind of response is some peace, some justice. So you dissolve this dilemma by having some trials that operate alongside truth commissions that are fact-finding bodies that are set up to investigate the causes, consequences, the victims, and identities of perpetrators of specified wrongdoing, often, but not always, in conjunction with some amnesty provision to incentivize participation in truth commission proceedings and reparations. That was the South African model. One way that the South African model was defined, especially by the chairperson of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was in terms of response for. So Desmond Tutu said, peace is justice if we understand justice as restorative justice. So by trying to navigate around the dilemma in the face of critics who sued the South African government for violation of constitutional rights by the structure that the South African TRC was set up in ways that permitted amnesty for perpetrators of rights violations, the response was there is a measure of justice that's being achieved. And then another response is no peace without transitional justice. So that's the response that I interrogate in my book. And the idea there is to achieve peace, you need to pursue justice that is transformational. So building positive peace in the aftermath of conflict or repression requires not simply returning to the status quo, because the status quo is what generated conflict and repression, but a transformation of that status quo, and there's justice involved in doing that. So why does positive peace, as peace-building scholars talk about, which is not just the ending of conflict, but establishing the conditions for more peaceful interaction moving forward, why does it require transformation? I argue in my work because of what I call 4 circumstances that characterize communities navigating this peace versus justice dilemma. And so I'll briefly talk about what those conditions are. So some social scientists don't like general claims being made about features you find across contexts. I'm a philosopher, so I'm not afraid of generalizations, but I'll just say that how these play out and what they look like can be very different depending on the context that you're talking about. So the first circumstance is what I call pervasive structural inequality. And that is referencing what are the rules for interaction among members of a political community and what do they look like? Where I take those rules for interaction to be shaped by the rules and norms that are articulated in law, in culture, in the structure of economic institutions, in the political organization of a community, where inequality is tracking the differential restrictions those rules and norms place on the ability of members of different groups to be respected, to be recognized as members of the political community, to participate in social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, and to avoid poverty. So there's kind of that dimension of inequality coupled with a dimension of inequality in the ability and the power to shape the rules and norms of interaction themselves. This inequality can be very explicitly articulated in various forms of apartheid. In South Africa, we can look at Jim Crow in the US, where there was all laid out in law. It can be a function of the effect of the way institutions are structured, even when not explicitly articulated along certain identity lines. But they generate powerful power asymmetries within communities and differential vulnerability to human rights violations. That's what the second feature is talking about, which is normalized collective and political wrongdoing. So by wrongdoing, I'm talking about violations of human rights that are normalized in an empirical sense. They become a basic factor of life around which members of a community that are disproportionately victims of a kind of human rights violation have to orient their conduct. So you have to orient, even if the laws say freedom of speech, if you know you're going to be arrested for engaging in certain forms of speech, because of who you are or the speech you want to engage in, you have to factor that into deliberation when thinking about what you're going to do. It's political in the sense that we're dealing with rights violations that are often committed by the state or state actors or with the permission of the state by failing to respect and protect the rights of members of communities that are being targeted. And often we're dealing with collective wrongdoing, where again, the groups that are being targeted can vary. It can be a function of race, it can be a function of religion, it can be a function of class, gender, nationality, ethnicity, a combination of those things depending on the community that we're dealing with, both of which generate fundamental uncertainty about authority, about the right and standing of the state to govern, and especially relevant for transitional justice, the right and standing of the state to deal with past wrongs and present wrongs, because the state is not, by definition, a neutral party or impartial party with respect to wrongdoing that's occurred. And then finally, serious existential uncertainty, where we're talking about the question of navigating this peace versus justice dilemma coming up in moments where the status quo, which could be crappy because it's just ongoing conflict and repression, suddenly becomes unclear. Perhaps there's an opening for a better way of structuring how we do things here because there's a peace agreement that's been signed, or there's constitutional reform that's been pursued, or some other, or protests that have led to attention of the public being grabbed in a particular way. But where there's suddenly things might be different if we navigate the peace versus justice dilemma right. As I was just saying, kind of peace requires transformation because of the circumstances that I laid out, and in particular the first two, because of the ways in which interaction is structured to be unequal and is going alongside patterns of wrongdoing that become entrenched and normalized. When I'm talking about transformation, as I've indicated, I'm talking about overhauling, fundamentally altering how members of a community interact with one another and with officials and officials with them. And often you see in the context of transitional justice appeal to political reconciliation, where that's taken to be repairing of relationships. Often it's equated with or linked with forgiveness. I don't link it with forgiveness in that way. But it's an objective that's trying to get at this idea of changing how we do things here. Why transformation in the context of transitional justice is pursued via dealing with past wrongdoing is because of the presence of pervasive denial about wrongdoing that's characteristic of the context where the peace versus justice dilemma comes up. Stanley Cohen, in a 2001 book on states of denial, distinguishes three different kinds of denial about wrongdoing that we can talk about. So we can talk about literal denial, kind of denial about the truthfulness of certain factual claims that are being made. So in Argentina, I'm going to give you an example of a museum in Argentina in a minute, which is why I'm referencing that, and I talk about it in my book. But in the context of the military junta that predated the transition to democracy there, you would have leaders come up and say, there are no political prisoners here. We don't have political prisoners in Argentina, right, as people were being disappeared from the streets. You have interpretive denial, where you're not challenging a factual claim, but you're contesting its normative significance. So torture is regrettable excesses, or there might have been isolated instances of wrongdoing. They don't constitute a policy, right? That would magnify the scale of wrongdoing that we're dealing with. So kind of interpreting what you acknowledge is happening in ways that diminishes its moral significance. Or implicatory denial, where you are shifting responsibility for wrongdoing that's acknowledged and might also be acknowledged as wrongful onto parties other than those who are responsible. So if you think about President Trump claiming that DEI was responsible for the plane crash, right, in DC a few weeks ago, displacing responsibility in that way. But you have, government actors displacing responsibility for disappearing under communist agitators, or other forms of what ultimately become victim blaming. You're responsible for the conditions of wrongdoing that you find yourself having been subjected to. So one thing that Cohen talks about, I'm just giving you what I just defined, is the way in which official denial, when it happens, relies on reciprocal interaction between citizens and government officials. So government officials can't pull a fast one unless there are willing listeners. That the constraints and vocabulary for what can be denied, plausibly, how it can be denied, and by whom, is parasitic on cultural vocabularies of denial and a sort of commitment to back up one another's denial. Where if officials are denying things, it's only in the kind of safe space of knowing it won't be called out by those you're worried about getting called out in ways that could lead to actual contestation of the credibility of the denial that's happening. So in the context of transitional justice then, against this background of denial, which is present anywhere you've got structural inequality and normalized wrongdoing that's taking place, you have the thought that you need to respond to past wrongdoing to get acknowledgement of what happened and its seriousness and determine responsibility for it for any kind of transformation to be possible, right? Because without acknowledging there is bad that occurred, there won't be a need to change anything because there's no reason that's recognized as being generating that need. And without appreciating the full extent of the damage to relationships, relational transformative efforts won't be successful, right? Can scratch at the surface but not get at root causes. Because these past wrongdoing that we're dealing with had particular victims, individuals were harmed concretely in specific ways, as well as perpetrators and actors responsible for them, you see a lot of emphasis in transitional justice on the importance of being victim-centered in responses, not using victims in instrumental ways for the sake of the broader transformative goal, but being attentive to the claims that victims have as victims to have what treatment they were subjected to being acknowledged, contrary to literal denial, to be acknowledged as wrongful and in violation of rights claims that victims have, and that victims were not responsible for their own subjugation or mistreatment and abuse. There's a lot of discussion on how you balance these two things, what it means to and the extent to which transitional justice efforts have been properly and fully victim-centered and victim-driven as against the broader kind of societal goal of trying to make things better in the terms on which we interact. And I'll come back to that at the end. Just one final thing before I turn to memorialization, and that is on the role of political polarization in the context where transitional justice is talked about, because all of these contexts are deeply polarized. Part of the reason why denial plays out in the way that it does is because of the presence of multiple incommensurable narratives of history, of conflict, of repression, of who is the victims and who are the perpetrators, of what events are salient and significant. So when I went to Northern Ireland in 1998, when there was a peace agreement ending that was up for communal vote that was going to end the troubles there, there was a museum that had from the partition of Ireland in 1923, I want to say, up until the present, kind of a bifurcation of two narratives among nationalists and unionists, or Catholics and Protestants, those overlap, about what had happened over the past 70 years. So you've got different narratives, different understandings of who requires recognition, what needs to be acknowledged, and by whom. You also have often, because of these stark narratives, stark binaries of perpetrator-victim. So lack of nuance in ways that is never accurate to the empirical reality of, for example, dealing with complex victims. victims who also were perpetrators, and trying to pay attention to and recognize both of those facts at once. So Dominic Onwin, one of the defendants who was put on trial and convicted by the International Criminal Court, was abducted as a child when he was 10 years old in Uganda, and was subjected to himself atrocities before going on to become one of the leaders and committing atrocities in turn. And a lot of the sentencing by the ICC was about this question: how do we recognize both of these things at once in determining what constitutes a fair and appropriate punishment in this case? So you get a kind of ignoring of complicated realities, not necessarily equally the simplification that goes on, but to some extent equally present in these contexts. All right. So memorials I take to be material or virtual objects which serve to represent events or persons who should not be forgotten. Memorials are omnipresent in transitional contexts. So this is from ESMA. I'm going to show you photos that I took, so I apologize for the varying degrees of quality of shot. So this is the ESMA Museum in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So it was one of the military training centers that was used for torturing and killing and interrogating before killing individuals who were disappeared by the military junta. And so you see on the first image some of the images of those who were killed during the course of the military reign. You've got numbers of those who were affected and sort of the inside of what the detention center looked like. You have in South Africa the Apartheid Museum, which is a museum about the history of apartheid, which includes not only the kind of visual images which you see in Argentina of different kinds, some newspaper stories from the time, but also has running recordings of the hearings of the South African Truth and Reconciliation when that was taking place. And one of the images, you weren't supposed to take a picture, but I kind of stuck one because I thought it was appropriate, is putting conversation of Jim Crow and apartheid together, looking at the time frame and timelines of the two histories and other transnational dimensions of those forms of apartheid here and apartheid there. And then this is from the Little Rock Central High School kind of visiting center across from the Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, where when you go inside, there are quotes about why remember, and then images from the civil rights era over protests and over school integration. So memorialization takes many forms, these memorials that come up in many different places. And in 2020, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion of Truth, Justice, Reparation, and Guarantees of Non-Recurrence produced this report on memorialization as the fifth pillar of transitional justice. So Fabian Salvioli, who was the rapporteur at the time, argued that it needed to be recognized as just as critical as the four pillars that had previously been recognizing as what needed to happen for this kind of transformative aim in ways that do right by victims to be achieved. So the previous four pillars were known as truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. The importance of having truth recovering commissions set up to identify and acknowledge the extent and causes and consequences and identities of perpetrators and victims of rights violations, again, when that has been denied or is not known to the full extent or not officially acknowledged even when it is known and evidence is present. Justice in the form of accountability, reparations addressing the loss and harm of victims, and then guarantees of non-recurrence to establish conditions for non-repetition. So memorialization was added by Salvioli because of the role that it plays in shaping culture and communities, and so understanding of the past. So All cultures, Savioli says, not uniquely, include as part of their self-understanding an understanding of history, of how we've come to be who we are, of what our relationships are and what our hopes and aims are for the future moving forward. And done well, he said, memorialization can be a vital tool for enabling societies to emerge from cycles of hatred and conflict and begin taking definite steps towards building a culture of peace. So Salvioli said there are different specific contributions to building democratic societies and achieving peace that memorialization and memory processes have. One kind of contribution is just by remembering the ugly, the abuses and the atrocities of the past. We can in that way promote a commitment to maintaining or establishing a democratic society in the present. That we can encourage debates about the past, about how it has been represented and how it is represented now, about the causes and consequences, because there's always, in the context of transitional justice, trying to preserve a space for debate, while at the same time narrowing the range of permissible lies. So getting some baselines, and then about those baselines, having and allowing for, consistent with democratic commitments, rigorous debate. And so in that way, preventing future violence. And allowing the problems of the present to be seen in historical context. That rather than viewing them as isolated or new, seeing historical continuities between what's going on now and what has happened in communities before. But at the same time, and part of the point of the report is, there's no guarantees that through memorialization this happens. Rather, the converse can be true, that memorialization can play a role in dehumanizing, marginalizing, negatively stereotyping, and denying wrongdoing, and dehumanizing and stereotyping those who were victims of wrongdoing and maybe are victims in an ongoing manner today, creating cultures of martyrdom that can incite and lead to new forms of violence, and by those who are desiring to reopen past wounds or are using the mantle of victimhood in a distorted way and prior humiliation as a mechanism for justifying violence in the present, and entrenching denialism rather than countering it. And so he argues in this report, he's a UN rapporteur, in the context of law, he's like, states have a duty then, and international duties and responsibilities around memorialization, to pursue memorialization in a human rights promoting manner that derives from state recognized obligations to guarantee the right of individuals not to be victims of serious human rights violations, and the principles that are articulated in various covenants and documents for the protection and promotion of human rights through actions to combat impunity. So that's the point of the report, that memorialization matters, there's no guarantee it'll be done well, and states have a duty and responsibility to do it in a human rights promoting rather than human rights denying manner. So he says, states have a duty to preserve, quote, collective memory from extinction, and in particular guard against the development of revisionist and negationist arguments. But he goes on to say, all too often, this fundamental obligation remains a dead letter in many societies that have suffered under authoritarian regimes or endured internal conflicts. Violence in the present, which is closely bound up with past events, is related to the fact that generations have grown up almost knowing nothing about the past, he says, in many cases and contexts. So this is kind of how memorialization, so I've talked about kind of transitional justice and its goals, why memorialization is being prioritized as one of the key tools for never again to be realized in an enduring manner, and to support the truth-seeking and justice-achieving and reparative measures that have already been recognized. And so finally, I'll end a little bit in talking about AI, which is the buzzword today. That's not why I'm talking about, but it is a buzzword. So artificial intelligence refers to kind of the capacity of machines, I'm taking one definition, to act as rational agents by taking actions that's based upon certain inputs that are received from their surroundings. And there are, I'm going to talk about two different kinds of AI-based processes. One that's based on machine learning, in which there's a use of algorithms and data training processes for the drawing of conclusions or making of predictions, or, as I'll show in a moment, answering of questions that are posed to certain machines. There's also generative AI, which is not algorithmically based and it's not rule-based, but which produces original content from the data that machines are trained on. So AI is being widely utilized in a number of ways in transitional justice processes. I'll just flag some of them, and then I'll talk about the holograms, which is the particular utilization that I've been thinking about. But it's used in forensic analysis to try and help match DNA to remains that are found. It's used in the context of ongoing conflict and after conflict as a way of mapping and analyzing data from different sources to try to identify objects, to try and identify detention centers, to try and identify persons and matching them to places in cases of individuals who've been disappeared, try to verify sources of information and data that's produced. There's been the utilization of platforms for digital storytelling as a way of trying to facilitate public participation in truth recovery processes. So a lot of harnessing of this kind of technology. But Holocaust museums in 2015 began pioneering a new use of AI technology against the background of the basic reality that many Holocaust survivors were dying. And so when confronted with a situation in which at one point there will be no more living Holocaust survivors, and where many Holocaust survivors had been actively engaging with Holocaust museums, and as part of powerful interactions with visitors to museums, to talk about their experiences, USC's Institute of Creative Technology developed a technology that was designed to create holograms of survivors so that they would be able to tell their stories when they were no longer physically here. And so what that involved was Holocaust survivors sitting down in ways that you see right there with the green technology screen, being filmed in 360 degrees so that what started out as a sort of FaceTime equivalent conversation then became a 3D technology, so they were future-proofing, as they said, this technology, but they had survivors answer 1,000 questions about their experiences while being filmed, and then used the algorithms as a way of trying to match answers from survivors to questions that were anticipated would be asked by visitors to the museum and different forms of them being asked, so that the question from the visitor would prompt the right answer or an accurate answer by the hologram through this use of algorithms. Survivors helped curate some of these, the algorithmic refining and process of answering. There's a continual kind of reflecting on and refining of the answers over time so that algorithms can be better able to understand what's being asked and provide and refine their answers. There were challenges, so there's a fantastic, Kayo Gamber wrote an article about the mechanics of developing these holograms, which is a lot of what I'm taking from here. Challenges in introducing these in museums for the first time because visitors didn't know exactly what to do, right? What button to punch, or it's kind of weird, like how do you, there's no like clicking FaceTime to start the conversation, what do you do? There was a lot of attention paid to how to make the algorithms inviting. So the manner in which, a lot of emphasis on eye contact and how to ensure that there would be eye contact with the hologram and the visitor, ensuring comprehension of questions by the kind of, voice recognition and comprehension. And so this is just, there's been programs about it. This is one, I don't know if we're going to hear the sound. I didn't test this before, but this is one of the holograms that was featured on, I think it was 60 Minutes, and has been on different YouTubes. I apologize for the sound, but this is kind of what it looks like. And kind of the thought, as I mentioned before, about the use of holograms is because of part of a broader shift within museums to an emphasis on the visitor experience. And in the context of museums that are dealing with atrocities, trying to ensure that the experience of coming to a place that is dedicated to periods of abuse is a powerful in evoking emotions that underscore the significance of never again and the sort of commitment on the part of the visitor to that commitment, right? And to recognizing the importance of it. And so it's a way of trying to preserve some degree of the particular significance that interacting with survivors has on visitors to museums. So not in the context of the holograms, but when I first went to South Africa 20 years ago and went to Robben Island, who took you around Robben Island? That's where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned during apartheid, were former prisoners, talking about and pointing to where they had been, the cell that they had lived in, what their routine had been, how it had affected them. So the kind of powerful experience of having this person before you talking about their life experience is sort of the impetus behind trying to preserve that when there are survivors no more. Another thing to note, to set up the three concerns I have about the use of this technology, granting the significance that they potentially hold, so it's more about risks that I want to flag that I think they generate. Museums are now, like everything, a globalized venture. So you have consulting firms that are dedicated to the setup, to the orientation of museums, even museums that are dealing with dark tourism, right, of this kind. And so you see the kind of already conversation. I was part of a project that was in conversation with the Japanese American National Museum, and we went to the Peace Museum in Hiroshima, but they're both interest on the survivors of the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the one hand, and then survivors of Japanese internment during World War II in the context of the US, wanting to harness this technology because, again, you've got folks who are on the cusp of dying and very few survivors who are currently alive. So against this trend, and in the background of the recognitions about how memorialization can go wrong, that Salvioli quite astutely flagged, I think there's three reasons for pausing and thinking more carefully about the design and use of holograms that I want to end by flagging. I'm still good on time, right? Okay. So one is kind of the algorithmic effects of visitors to museums. And the algorithmic effects I have in mind are with respect to two different kinds of visitors. One is the sort of global tourist visitor, the me going to South Africa, right? And then Hiroshima, and where you have folks who are not from the communities that the history that's being dealt with where it occurred, coming to interact with these holograms where the perspective that's brought and the questions that are asked might not map onto necessarily the questions that are most salient for descendants of victims, for members who are living in the communities that the museums are in. And so what kind of distorting effects might that have on what becomes prioritized? What are the questions to ask and the answers that are most ready? I also worry about bad faith visitors. So algorithmic manipulation and the distorting effects of folks who have no interest in learning the history, that's not the point, but have an interest in shaping the algorithms, and how that might shape and distort again the kind of narrative that's emerging from the holograms and their interaction with visitors, if they're being trained on these interactions. A second worry that I have, or pause for concern that I think about, is in terms of generative holograms, which I think it's only a matter of time before they're on the horizon, where you are creating, not from algorithms that is trained on and sort of restricted by the database, but when you're generating new content, new answers, and that might be new answers that are being generated by holograms that are trained on the answers given by particular survivors, but need not be. Could be, especially in the context of the globalization of the development of museums, be trained on many, many, many survivors from many different places. And the interviews and answers to questions that were given there. And so, again, depending on, garbage in, garbage out for all of these. So depending on the data that you're training and trying to generate output from, the possibilities of entrenching denialism, of deep fakes, but in the context of holograms, of narratives that emerge from holograms based on actual survivors, but that come to offer narratives that are in deep tension with what, if you're a family member of a survivor or from a community from which victims come, that you anticipate would be given, the authenticity, I guess, of that as well. And I think there's a lot of just fraught debate over ownership of the information and the technology themselves, and of the ownership of survivors over their story, or of descendants over their story, because of what we see already happening in the context of art, where you see generative reproductions of Mona Lisa or of other artwork, and copyright law struggling to know what to do with that, and how to think about artistic production and protection of rights and authorship in this new context. And the final thing I worry about is the digital divide. So one of the, there are many critiques of transitional justice as a global practice that have been advanced. One of the overarching concerns is that a lot of the knowledge and expertise on how you navigate the peace versus justice dilemma and deal with the past resides in the global south, in countries that have done this most extensively, but that also are seen as the sites for transitional justice rather than the experts on transitional justice, and where there's often a technological divide. That access to the internet, that access to opportunities to sort of have your story digitized in this way and be told are not as prevalent as access in the global north. And so again, against the background of the globalization of holograms in the museums, I worry about the erasure and distortion on a global level that comes from which stories are being told and by whom. And what picture of victims of atrocity is going to emerge in ways that I think very predictably are going to erase the stories and agencies of victims predominantly and disproportionately from the global south or from the global north in areas where access to technology, where the digital divide also exists here. And so duplicating that pattern also in the context of the global north, where the kind of ability to tell your story within this frame won't exist. And that's another form of erasure that I think unintentionally transitional justice might help to perpetuate. So I'll end there. And look forward to your questions.
Thank you for this talk. I was wondering about the necessity to historicize transitional justice or put it in its historical context. So the first incidence is basically post-World War II, but transitional justice as a concept, and here I want to get back to what Ned said earlier, proliferates in the 1990s. Together with Holocaust memory, human rights, and so on and so forth. So there's a particular moment, and yes, we call that transitional justice. But I also would like to suggest there's the possibility of transitional injustice. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is there's a little bit of a kind of how should I say, a pejorative tone to revisionism here. But revisionism in and of itself is not a problem. It just maybe it rubs us, if you're progressive, it rubs you the wrong way from one way or the other, but it's part of the game. So memorialization itself can be a means against revisionism, and revisionism as a means against memorialization, right? That is to say, you rewrite American history in the 1950s or 60s in order to put an end to this kind of ideological and so on and so forth. So revisionism can also be means for new memorization. And I want to ask you the following. Your image of Argentina, and Argentina really being very prominent in memory, I think Buenos Aires is probably the only place outside of New York where people still do Freudian psychoanalysis and Lacanian mumble-jumble. But there's also major post-junta work done there, right? I mean, there were really the women, Mayo, Plaza del Mayo, and all of this. Yeah. Fast forward to today, and you have Milei, the president, who right now is busy with the economy, but surely will turn to culture wars very soon. And he basically would fit under what Cohen calls interpretive denial. Right. So now we have a revisionism to a revisionism to a revisionism, and he basically says, no, the dirty war, that's a concept that I don't accept. On a side note, Milei himself was an advisor to two of the generals who committed the most violent atrocities, so he's not an innocent bystander, but in any event, he's a populist. He rules the country. So how do we deal with that? Is that creating polarization, and how can that happen, especially if it's in an autocratic context?
Yeah, no, that's great. So exactly right on the sort of, I mean, there's everything in transitional justice is the subject of debate and disagreement, including the genealogy of it. So depending on, some folks argue, John Elster says you go back to ancient Athens and you can find, a more common story is, as you were saying, in the 1990s, how to fit Nuremberg. There's variation in the positions that are taken. But you're right, it is at the 1990s, starting and led by Latin America, that you see the real kind of globalization of a practice. Latin America, South Africa being absolutely seminal in shaping global practice. Then in the 90s, around this sort of commitment to never again and to dealing with the past as a way of setting a future. So one of the roles that I have is, and this is going to get to your question about what about today. So one of the roles that I have is as co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Transitional Justice. And one of the things that we do every year is the first issue is always a thematic issue. It's a special issue. And the special issue for 2025, which just came out, is on the afterlives of transitional justice. And it's basically asking this question, what to think about the practice of transitional justice in light of the fact that you're seeing this repolarization and spread of autocracy, authoritarianism, populism in precisely the places that have been most systematic, not only the places, but Guatemala, Argentina, where you had these processes, and what does that mean for transitional justice? So on that, and in Argentina specifically, the director of ESMA was up at Illinois for a conference in the spring and was worried about being targeted, and has been targeted already by the government. So I think that I think so what to make of all of this? I think one is just the basic insight that no progress is enduring. That it's a mistake. One of the critiques that had been made of the way that South Africa framed its the road to truth, the road to reconciliation is through the truth, was that it made it seem like once we got through the Truth Commission, then we're there, right? Which of course was impossible. But I think there's other ways in which the kind of necessity of remembering that the work of memorialization is never done, that this goes in line with an increasing emphasis around education within transitional justice, that the transmission of experience doesn't happen automatically and can be lost. So I think part of what this asks about is kind of what are the enduring practices after you have ones that are more one-off trials and truth commissions, which I think is part of the impetus behind memorialization, because it has that longer temporal focus. And I think also the second thing to say is just that success or failure in these contexts is really hard to determine, because the root inequalities and practices are so deeply entrenched that the multiplicity of processes you need to actually effectively try and get at root causes, it's outside the capacity of any single process to be able to do. So I don't think it follows that ESMA and the Truth Commission in Argentina achieved nothing. Some of the issues in the special paper are trying to adopt political scientists' empirical methods to track success and failure, but they didn't do everything. And they can't do everything, and nothing will stick automatically, especially when you've got raw divisions. So, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that right now.
I want to bring you back to AI if I can, which was
Sure.
for me the new part of the paper. So I've been intrigued since the holograms came out at first, particularly because it seemed to offer to me a non-narrative way, even though you use the word narrative, but because it's not the testimony, which is crafted into a story, but you get to ask the questions. 1,000 questions were asked, and then you can replot it yourself. But something that I'm curious if maybe you can update since the article came out that you were referring to, and since these holograms were first generated, there's been a revolution the last couple of years, is the move from algorithm, as you said, to generative AI. And if you could, for a moment, just dwell on what that means in terms of where we are now, where we're proceeding, and especially if you want to flag risks, is of course the risk of what we now call hallucination. Generative AI can invent its answer in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that was one of the kind of the generative holograms and generative use of AI at the end. That was part of the some of the concerns. I didn't quite get to the hallucination, the outright fabrication. But I think it is one of the concerns that's raised. And I think one of the things that part of your comment made me think of is the ways in which this use of holograms represents a really interesting shift. So for a lot of in the agency, who is exercising agency in these tools for dealing with the past. So one of the criticisms of trials from a victim perspective in transitional justice was the ways in which they are so structured by legal rules and by the examination and cross-examination. So the questions that are being asked by defense counsel or the prosecutor, that victims don't get to tell their story on their own terms and in their own way. It's only what's relevant to the case at hand. And it's oriented around the perpetrator, the defendant that's on the trial. And so one of the points that was emphasized with truth commissions is that they offer a platform in which victims can tell their story on their own terms, right? That there's not the sort of regimentation according to the questions that are relevant for lawyers or relevant instrumentally for determining guilt or innocence, and that's a way of reclaiming and claiming one's own story and having it told publicly and acknowledged publicly in the terms that you want. There were a lot of initial thoughts about that being cathartic. It's not always. It can be re-traumatizing for many to speak to experiences of abuse. But one thing that's interesting that your comment made me think of about holograms is it's shifting the agency. The agency now resides in the asker, in the user and the visitor, and it's shifted away from the survivor. Now, when you're dealing with holograms and it's not real, it might not raise such acute questions and problems. But I think the concern that transitional justice has had around allowing victims to shape the narrative of what happened to them, to define its wrongfulness, to have that be acknowledged, what they're concerned about, there's a risk that these holograms or other AI generative technologies, to the extent that they are shaping the narrative, will undermine that ability on the part of survivors and victims, and especially in the context if you're not even at the table to have your story be told or be asked about.
How much are visitors currently told about, like given some kind of warning, or like, this is what we think this person would say, compared to this is what this person said?
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't know the full answer. I don't know if you know the answer on that. I know that they're set up differently, the whether you get to choose who you're having a dialogue with or not, whether you're alone in having interactive dialogue or in a room with others. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. So this is on the basis of nothing you should take anything, could be all fake news, what I'm saying now, but if there isn't that sort of explicit, this is a prediction of an answer rather than an answer, and part of that's intention with the whole wanting to make this really real, right? Wanting to make it so that you are engaged like an actual conversation where I'm looking at you and we're having a conversation, and it seems like I'm talking with a real person when I'm really interacting with a machine.
I guess I'm thinking of some exhibit I saw someplace. I think it might have been at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, where it's like told through a fictional child, but then they have like actual quotes from real child survivors. Well, I mean, then adult, but
right.
Real child survivors. And it was like super obvious. They're like, Johan never existed, but we are telling this story through Johan. And it sounds like the problem with the hologram is like, my face and my voice is associated with it. So it's not as clear that it's not actually me.
Right, and there is a deeper sense in which it is you, because it is your answer. I mean, to the extent that you're restricted, you've got answers from a database that are from survivors, there's a sense in which it is you as much as it's not you in the way it would be me if we're having a conversation. So I think and this gets back to the worry about the blurring of the lines between and the risk of introducing skepticism that shouldn't be that isn't warranted about the truthfulness of the events that are being recorded or the experiences of people, even if it's a compilation of the experiences of many different individual testimonies. And I don't have the language or the framework yet to sort of navigate these complexities, but I think these are the ones that there are that need to be thought through for technology to do the work it's hoped to do.
Yeah, I'm trying to formulate. There's so many things swirling around in my mind about the whole experience of memorialization and museum experience. We're talking about holograms, but these are all kinds of degrees of, the word that comes to mind is making pristine something that is so barbaric and brutal. And we go from, let's say, incredible museums such as in Hiroshima, or the new museum, the African American Museum in DC, the brand new museum in Montgomery, which is almost, and I don't say this with any kind of, not as a joke, but as a sort of an amazing, if Disney had made a museum towards civil rights, the use of technology, it's pretty spectacular. But that word pristine, and then you go to a place like Dachau, or maybe in South Africa, where you get to go to the site. And then you go to another level, the most profound experience one of the most profound experiences of my life was not too long after the killing fields in Cambodia, and I met two young men who I thought were boys, but had only survived on a few grains of rice every day, so they were in miniature, these young men, and they took me all around Cambodia, and to go to the killing fields where you walk through the fields and there are bones sticking out with clothing, and the towers of bones, and you're alone in these fields. There aren't other tourists. So I'm trying to formulate a question here, because there's so much cognitive dissonance as we talk about going from an AI to, which isn't really real, and all these great questions coming up, to where is the responsibility, here's where I think my question is, of informing every museum goer, every person who goes to a site, that this really isn't real. This is a simulation of the horrendous brutality of what occurred at all of these that we're trying to memorialize. So I guess where do we go with this as far as constantly reminding the visitor of the brutality, if that is the question?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the last part of what you were saying and then go back a little bit to what you were saying at the beginning. So this question is one that I think discussions around truth commissions can be helpful in thinking about, because there was a lot of debate around how to frame the findings of a report, where on the one hand, again, you're trying to combat denial. So denial about, the extent to which the government targeted and killed South African anti-apartheid activists, right? And how brutal were the methods that were used, kind of basic denial about what forces were involved in. Counter that, and on the other hand, allow for recognition of the incompleteness of the report that something like the South African TRC finds, because not all victims necessarily came forward, not all perpetrators testified fully and completely, not all wrongs were addressed. So the basic wrongs of apartheid, as opposed to the extraordinary violence that accompanied the enforcement and contestation of apartheid, was not dealt with by the TRC itself. And so there was a lot of discussion around how to frame the findings as authoritative. It's not just our opinion. It's not just, these were verified. This was, and corroborated the testimony in different ways. So it's not just someone's word coming out, although someone's word should be enough, was also what they were trying to reinforce, not to put undue burdens on victims to have to prove what happened to them in ways that have very awful consequences for victims in a lot of contexts, where you need like a doctor's report to prove you were raped, rather than just saying that was what happened to me. Or if you won't go to a doctor when you were, raped. And so there's all these hard questions around how to communicate verification and the authority of the findings without putting them beyond dispute, without saying we might expand our understanding of the underlying causes, our understanding of the consequences might be incomplete, the way we situate apartheid in terms of the history of South Africa. That was another thing that was problematized in the South African report. So I think analogous sorts of debates need to happen in the context of museums and memorialization to frame, don't think we just made it all up, right? We're not just putting here what we think will be exciting to see. There's credibility and corroboration and authenticity of what we're saying, but it's a fraction of the full story. So I think that's one way in which there might be fruitful engagement further. But the other thing I was going to say about which was triggered by what you were saying about the Hiroshima Museum, as part of this conference, collaborative project with Kyushu University in Japan and Illinois, we had the museum director give us a tour. And one of the things he talked about was how the museum itself had been reimagined. So originally, it was basically an engineering museum. It was about the mechanics of the atomic bomb, right? And it was focused on how it was dropped, the science behind it. So this kind of focus on the objects of those who were killed, like the little tricycle of... Right, which is still there. But that was not the way it was imagined. And then, again, as part of a movement towards visitor experience, I mean, if you're an engineer, that would have been cool, but it's not going to have the same kind of effect as we want this to be an engaging experience. I worry about the framing, though, of the experience and the manipulation of emotions when part of the experience is around eliciting emotions of certain kinds. So I think fundamentally there needs to be, but I don't have the expertise in museums to do it, but I think space for another reimagining of what museums are for.
That is a good example, that it would originally be an engineering,
Right.
It would all be sort of objectified.
Yeah.
While
Have you ever seen an atomic bomb? Here it is, just like how it works.
to the actual brutality.
Right.
And savagery.
Right.
All of these memorializations.
Right. But I think the holograms and all this, who are museums for? And when we think about who they are for and what they're for, I just worry about the prioritization of the victim experience, not the victim experience, the museum visitor experience in ways that I think just facilitate the kind of either manipulative engagement with visitors and their playing on emotions and
Also keeping it pristine in a way and remove.
right. If people don't want so much yuck, right? It's not supposed to be Disneyland, right? It's not supposed to be comfortable. But you want people to go there too, as part of the communicating of history. And so, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think that's part of the questions I would be interested in hearing more about, other ways of imagining museums and what and who they're for.
Well, please join me in thanking our fantastic speaker.